Info nodes. My goodness, there's a lot of them. Not just the native ones, but of course those that are provided by third parties as plugins. We'll start with just a look at the regular old item info. Basically, all that the info nodes do is give you information about a given something. So for instance here in item info, I can tell it to look at an object, for instance a null that I've got in the scene, and this gives me a bunch of information for it. Its position, its right, up, forward, rotation, scaling values. These of course are the keyframed values here for position and scale, the world position, and of course the pivot rotation, as well as the position of the pivot here. And that's all it is. You just use these infos for driving other things. For instance, I take a crackle texture here, which we pop onto this plane, and with the item info of the null, I can for instance connect the position to say, well, the position, and now the texture's position is being driven by the null's position, so effectively the texture is kind of stuck to the null. I can plug the rotation to the rotation, and rotating my null now rotates the texture. Oddly enough backwards, which we've seen elsewhere in other videos as well. There's obviously some kind of inversion on the rotation for textures here. But we could do other fun stuff, like I could plug the position into the rotation. Now we see that I get this kind of effect, of course, where the X is driving the heading, or maybe I plug the rotation to the position, and now I sort of get a scroller for my texture there. The heading, of course, is now operating the X-axis. And that really is all that any of the info nodes are for, just getting the information about one thing so as you can use that in something else. Item info is incredibly common, you'll use it a lot. There are of course other infos worthy of note, like the instance info, which is very handy when using the nodal controls in instancing for the positioning, scaling, coloration and so on. We do of course have even more instance infos from DP that give slightly different collections of info, like is instance, is an object an instance or is it not? Particle info is very handy, of course, if you want to use nodal shading in hypervoxels. This gives you access to everything like particle age, the relative age, the positions, velocity, the mass of the particle, the age it was at the collision point, the index value, or the number of each individual particle, which of course allows you to start doing per particle coloration or surfacing. Spot info that gets everyone, that gives information about the spots of a surface, which might be a handy way to think about it. You can think about this as surface info, giving information about the polygonal surface rather than the object. Dpont's point info that can take a point index or a set of point indexes and output the various information about those points. You'll notice of course that you have an object lookup so as it knows which object's points it is looking at. You can also of course select a weight map in here, and the weight scalar output will tell you the weight value at each evaluated point. Of course we have other things like TrueArt's extended item info, much like regular item info but with some additional outputs on it. Dissolve if that's been set for an object, bounding box, scales here, speed, very useful. We can use that to start determining the acceleration or deceleration of objects. And of course things from its motion options, the name of its parent item, target item, goal item. Of course we're used with instances to being able to use the instance ID to drive material changes or whatever else. TrueArt has added a clone index here, so we can do basically the same thing with object clones. Very handy. Time info from DBW tells you the current time, the current frame number, and of course the frames per second setting that your scene is at. And plenty of useful ones from Dpont, like bone info, that is basically like item info but for bones, where of course you select the object and then the bone that you're looking at. Channel info, that can give you info about pretty much any channel in your scene, which can be especially useful if you're using things like master channels or anything of that nature. Basically a channel that's not a normal object channel, so would not appear on item info. Position, rotation, scaling. See, with channel info, I can get the master channels and everything in here. Also, because it has a time input, I could be using something like good old db&w time info, perhaps shove in a subtract, or maybe an add, and I could be evaluating the channel value for something as it was perhaps 1 second earlier than the current frame. Or if I wanted 1 frame earlier, let's say I was at 24 frames per second, then it would be 1/24 seconds earlier. Very useful channel info. Could be used, for instance, in that fashion in a motion info or displacement or something, to create a new motion that follows an existing motion but delayed in time, as well as of course being modified other ways in the network. I must confess there are some I'm not so sure about, like TrueArt's product info here that outputs integers for the Lightwave version being used, the build being used, is it layout, is it modeler. I can think of very few reasons to use this in a normal node network, but hey, there it is. So there we go, the info nodes. They are many, and basically just represent different kinds of information that you can get about a given item. Its object position, its object number, the position of its points, its position in time, and so on and so forth.